Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. Today we're going to be returning back to South America. It's a topic that's been in the news a lot. If you've been focusing on what's going on in the United States right now, you'll see that U.S. farmers are extraordinarily anxious because the Chinese, get this, last year they bought $12 billion of soybeans. This year they have bought zero. Not one soybean has been bought from a U.S. farmer. Instead, the Chinese have shifted their soy buying to Brazil and now even Argentina. And just in the past couple of weeks, one of the things we've seen is that Donald Trump and his administration gave a bailout to the Argentinian government, in part because they want to replace the reliance that the Argentinian government has on a credit default swap with the Chinese. So the Americans have come in with a huge bailout for the Argentinians. What did the Argentinians do right after that was signed? Well, they took off some of the export taxes for soybeans, and the Chinese swooped in and bought a whole bunch of soybeans from the Argentinians. Now, time is running out for American farmers, in part because the season is coming to an end. Chinese stockpiles are actually quite full now, so there really isn't much time. Even if Trump and Xi can come to some kind of trade deal that would then start the buying, the Chinese don't have anywhere really to put more soybeans. So there's not going to be a lot of big buying from soybeans. The other issue that we've been following is over the past couple of weeks, the United States, and this was a Politico story, we haven't actually seen it, the Pentagon issued a new national defense strategy that is apparently sitting on Secretary of War Pete Hegseth's desk and is on its way to the president's desk, that reprioritizes the Western Hemisphere and the domestic homeland. Now, in U.S. President Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth's speech to the generals that happened last week in Washington, you can see the emphasis on the U.S. homeland, and there's been a lot more talk about the Western Hemisphere. And all of this brings us to this question of the United States, China, in the Western Hemisphere, in South America. So we may see, we don't know, but we may see a downgrading of the priority of confronting China and countering China in Asia and in Africa and in other parts of the world, and more emphasis in South and Central America. Now, this comes at a time when the U.S. is really competing hard in this region for trade and economic engagement. And there's a new book that comes out which makes the case that China is displacing the United States for economic primacy in the region. Economic Displacement, China and the End of U.S. Primacy in Latin America, by Francisco Urdinez, who is an assistant professor at the Political Science Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile. And he joins me today for the first time on the show. Congratulations, Francisco, on the new book. It's coming out at the end of October. And just before we get started, I want to let everybody know that in the show notes, we're going to have a discount code if you'd like to get a copy of it. Welcome to the program, Francisco.
Thank you, Eric. I'm very happy to be in your program. I'm a listener of it, so thank you for having me.
Well, we appreciate that. Let's talk about your main thesis, China and the End of U.S. Primacy in Latin America. It's a premise that at the surface I don't really understand. Let me just read a few statistics here about the current state of U.S.-China economic engagement in the region, and then I'd like you to help me understand how this primacy is coming to an end. When we look at total inflows of FDI in 2024, 38% came from the United States, about $71 billion. Just 2% comes from China. Of the 21 Latin American and Caribbean countries, between 10 to 13 have the U.S., not China, as their largest trading partner. And when we look at the volumes of trade between the U.S. and these Latin American countries, about $1.24 trillion in the Western Hemisphere goes between the U.S. and these countries, excluding Canada. And that is, almost 2.5 times what they do with the Chinese. Help us understand what you mean by the end of primacy when all of the figures seem to be lining up in the U.S. favor.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So the figures that you're pointing out are very different if you exclude Mexico on the first hand. Mexico here is the big outlier, and in the book, I make the case on how the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, more and more looks like two regions in its own. One that still has the U.S. as a major economic power and will remain so, and that is Mexico and Central America. But if you look at South America and a few countries in Central America like Panama and Costa Rica, you see an increasing phenomenon in which China is reaching or surpassing the economic influence of the US. So countries like Brazil, you had Tulio Cariello a few weeks ago, speaks of the economic importance that China has there. It's very large, its main economic partner by trade and increasingly by investment. He was making the case, and I want to make the case for other countries. China is catching up in stocks, but some years is surpassing the US in flows. And we shouldn't forget about the finance as well, Eric. For the last 15 years, Chinese banks, policy banks, the China Development Bank, the Exim Bank, and more increasingly so, commercial banks like the ICBC are making possible investment projects and leveraging Chinese capital. So the finance from Chinese banks are sort of vitamins, or they are kind of helping the Chinese enterprises to do better, and it's a very important part of the story as well. Where the U.S. still has a major distance from China is, of course, in aid. Although not every country in Latin
Even
America.
today, without USAID?
Well, I don't know, to be honest, because I finished the book in 2023, and I think without USA, the picture will look much different. But even with USAID, when I was in Washington at the Wilson Center, diplomats at the State Department always reminded me that there's a list for eligible countries, and Latin American countries not always are eligible for U.S. aid, nor so for credits from the, for example, from the um, policy bank that there's in Washington. There's a lot of discussion, and I used to be in discussions in Washington on how the U.S. could increase their economic presence in the region. And a lot of times there were barriers or regulations that impeded these agencies from lending money to South American countries. So to sum up, I think the figures that you are referring to, that um, I don't know the sources, to be honest, probably are masking this trend that I observed, that Mexico is a very big outlier. I think that in trade terms, China is the main trading partner for most South American countries now, with a few exceptions. Colombia is one of them. Paraguay as
And a lot
well.
of Caribbean, I think Caribbean states still have and that probably filled up the 10 to 12, or a lot of Caribbean states that still sell predominantly
Exactly.
into
So
the
if
US.
you refer to number of countries, yeah, the U.S. still has an important weight, but on the percentage of the market,
That makes
and
sense.
considering the relative importance of Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, China has gained a lot of weight, and what I focus most is in this region. I think economic displacement is taking place
Okay.
mostly in South America.
Well,
Um, hmm.
let's focus on South America. And in order for us to understand the premise of your book, that China is displacing the United States, maybe you can map out for us, what does U.S. economic engagement look like, and what does Chinese economic engagement look like? Are they complementary? Are they competitive? And when we talk about displacement, is it a one for one? So all of a sudden Fords are gone, but now we have BYDs, or is there more nuance to it?
So yeah, what I wanted to do, Eric, is to tell a story in which both variables are related to each other. I felt that a lot of people focused on China's great success in the global South, sometimes forgetting the role that the U.S. used to play, at least in South America. And what I found is that we observe a retrenchment. If you measure with equivalent measurements, which are hard to really compare, but let's say we create an index that measures the U.S.'s economic weight in the region. In the last 20 years, we observed that U.S.'s economic weight has shrunk to a half. So it diminished to a half of what it used to be in 2000. Meanwhile, the economic weight of China in the region would increase by 15. So the baseline was extremely low for China, and that explains the huge size in its increase. The second part of the story, which is the retrenchment or the shrinking of the U.S., I think is as interesting or perhaps more interesting than the China side of the story. And that shrinking, you could observe it as well in Africa and Asia. On the other hand, in Oceania and Europe, you see different stories. In Oceania, you see the U.S. remaining as relevant as it used to be 20 years ago. And in Europe, it became even more so important. So this is a story, I think, of the U.S. trying to prioritize some regions. And again, Mexico comes back in the story as a country that I think the U.S. has prioritized in Latin America, puts all its efforts in trying to keep Mexico engaged, and some Caribbean and Central American countries, but pretty much forgot about the rest. And the story to me is on how China's actors, hundreds of state-owned enterprises, privately owned enterprises, policy banks, state-owned banks, commercial banks, found opportunities in this part of the world to engage economically, especially because of the interest of Latin American actors, the hunger of Latin American actors for fresh capital. So I try to look at the agency of Latin American politicians and enterprises in the pursuit of China's capital in the last 20 years, to tell them, come and invest or lend us money. We're very interested in your offerings. And again, I think that's part of the story that hasn't been told a lot of the times. I think we focus a lot on China's grand strategy or China's successes. Sometimes we tend to observe China as monolithically. And I'm trying to get to the nuance on this so-called success story, looking at the sort of kind of the forgotten side, which is the U.S.'s side, and then the demand side from local actors. So the book put attention on those both variables.
So this is a match really that's ideal for the Chinese and for South Americans. China is a country that is resource poor but capital rich. It used to be a lot richer than it is today. There's a lot of debt in China. The Belt and Road spending has gone way down, but nonetheless, still relatively rich compared to others. South America is extraordinarily endowed with resources, but capital poor historically. So that match came together quite well. This is also a very complex region, many countries, hundreds of millions of people, very polarized politics. Maybe you can pick out a couple stories of the story you're trying to tell about some of the different engagements. Peru was very successful in attracting the Chancay port. In Argentina, where you're from, President Milei has politicized the relationship. Colombia also now very, very politicized. And in Chile as well, a highly politicized relationship. The leftist president has really leaned into the relationship with China, and now he's going to go to the polls facing a potential backlash from right-wing opponents. So help us understand some of that nuance. Maybe pick one or two countries and give us an example of how this dynamic is playing out.
Yeah, for the last years, there was a discussion here in the region on whether China's success was due to ideological affinities from especially the left-wing governments. I tried to debunk that hypothesis in the book, arguing that there are cases in pro-business right-wing governments like Piñera's government in Chile, Macri's in Argentina, that have engaged with China as much or more than their left-wing counterparts. Um, Shanghai, it's very interesting, Eric, because Shanghai, that's being on the news, and it's a very relevant project for the logistics and the trade relation with Asia in general. I discuss in the book how this project grew out of a bottom-up demand in which a local business, Vulcan, a Peruvian mining company, was looking for an opportunity to bring its mining produce, nickel and other, close to the coast, avoiding Lima. And it thought of the possibility of creating its own port in this little fishery town called Chancay. It bought the land, it had the political connections that were needed, um, and it looked for partners that could bring the capital for what came out to be a very expensive project. And a Chinese conglomerate, Czech, that was present in Peru, had the political connections with Balkan. These Chinese consortia had built in the last years their relationships, and they knew the local elites, and they put Balkan in touch with Costco in a trip to China.
And
And
Costco is the state shipping company, the main China's
exactly,
largest shipping company, right? Yep.
yeah, probably the largest logistical company now in the world, who was very interested in the project and said, well, we can bring the money that you need. It's a few $1 billion. And we can also bring financiers. We can bring a few banks. So there's a cluster of actors, Sinosure, providing the insurance for the project, and a few commercial banks that are financing around $900 million, and Costco itself is owning a big part of the project. So this became a privately owned, so to speak, project in the sense that it's pushed by two enterprises, a Chinese and a Peruvian. And then it's when this becomes news, and the Peruvian government says there's something strategic here going on. There's something that we could capitalize, and they start to refer to the port as this huge success, and you start to see presidents attending ceremonies in the port, supporting, of course, the project for strategic reasons. And then you see China's kind of framing the project as part of the BRI, and eventually Xi Jinping taking part of the opening of the port. So the state, the national state, in this case, comes kind of later. You first needed the private actors agreeing to invest and risk a lot of money in this very risky project that had a lot of problems, environmental problems, regulatory problems. And then is when the government came and kind of steps in. And this is interesting because it shows that sometimes what we frame as BRI or China's successes are results of interactions that go beyond its own control and start way back in time. Another example, you mentioned Millet. Um, Millet has now sort of leaned extremely towards the U.S. in a desperate move to avoid a default, and the U.S. is looking to a currency swap not very different from the swap that the Bank of China had offered a few years ago to Argentina. Argentina has a swap of around 18 billion US dollars if you convert the renminbi to USD, and has had activated around five. Um, people say in Buenos Aires that a condition for the U.S. to provide a 20 billion U.S. dollar swap from the U.S. to Argentina is to um, kind of forget about the Chinese swap line and end that line. Uh, One of another condition is to stop a few strategic infrastructure projects that are um, halfway through. They are started but not completed. And one of these projects is a couple of dams in Patagonia, in Argentina. And I discussed this case in the book. The project again is halfway through. So these dams, if you go to southern Argentina, you will find all these kind of structures that are, it's not yet working as a dam. It's been under construction for more than 10 years. A very Argentine stories in that sense, full of frustrations even for the Chinese conglomerate, Gechoba. A lot of headaches for them. But the interesting part of this story, Eric, is that this grew in part of the um, initiative of governors. And I think Tulio was speaking of this in attracting Chinese investments in Brazil. Governors and majors having extremely smart in South America in sometimes bypassing national governments and reaching to Chinese investors themselves.
And
And
if I understand, in Argentina, a lot of the lithium deals are done at the provincial level, not at the national level. And so even if Milei wanted to try and cut some of that off, if in his campaign, remember, he said he's never going to do business with communists and he talked a tough game. When he came to power, interestingly enough, the Chinese also played hardball. They threatened to not renew the credit swap. They put a freeze on some of the trade. And all of a sudden Milei was backed into a corner and then said, okay, private business can continue to do it, but the Argentinian government will not. And it just makes me wonder if Milei is in as strong a position as he thinks he is, because the Chinese buy a considerable amount of Argentinian beef, now soybean, lithium, any number of products. Look at what they're doing to the U.S. If they're willing to put a Kansas farmer and a Nebraska farmer on a pike and say, forget you, they're going to do that to the Argentinians if they get played the wrong way. So it's potential. And Argentina's economy, as you know all too well, is not exactly, shining right now. So the leverage feels like it's in the Chinese hands right now in terms of if they want to play hardball with the Chinese, great, let's do this. We've already done it before. We'll push you around again.
yeah, absolutely. And I agree that happened with Bolsonaro before. In Brazil, it will happen to Cast if Cast is elected the president in Chile. These right-wing anti-communist leaders in the region who think they can untangle a relationship with China that goes beyond their power, I think they are mistaken, or they do it to sort of calm their audiences. But I discussed the concept of structural power in the book. I think the Chinese capital has created this entangled web of interests that goes beyond national governments. It involves local elites, political elites, and markets that are not willing to stop selling to China, or stop buying from China. So I don't think that China's relevance in the region will diminish anytime soon, especially not because of ideological reasons. Um, Indeed, Chile, where I live, it's a very interesting case. For the other reason, Eric, we could speak of the problems that China brings. Chile exports 40% almost of its total exports to China. It's one of the largest degrees of export dependency in the world, especially because most of that 40% is comprised of copper and lithium.
Yeah.
So we have countries
But
that
quite
are
a bit of food,
extremely.
quite a bit of fruits and vegetables too make their way from Chile. When I was in China, I was in the supermarket and I saw a lot of grapes and a lot of
Wine.
produce from Chile as well, wine as well. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Chile has tried to diversify its basket, promoting salmon and the fruit, as you say. The Chilean cherries are pretty famous in China. Uh, but again, the economy as a whole is pretty much tied to China's demand. And that's something that governments cannot change in the short run. And I think that's something that the Chinese investors understood pretty early, 20 years ago, and they sort of understood that a way of dealing with the extreme political polarization that we live in South America in general, and these constant political swings, a way of hedge and protect from that is by creating strong networks with local elites, with provinces, with business leaders, and kind of creating long-term relationships also with law firms that have become extremely important, and kind of protect yourself and resist while the government is very aggressive towards you, and then flourish, as we see now Brazil now receiving record levels of investment from China after a few years of right-wing governments.
So the timing of your book is couldn't really be better, given the fact that we have so many key elections coming up, as I mentioned, where China is becoming a major issue. And correct me if I'm wrong here, we have a major election in Bolivia where the former president, who's now running again, wants to say if he is elected, he will cancel the lithium contracts with the Chinese and the Russians. In Chile, we have an election. In Brazil, we have an election. And also in Colombia, there's an election. In all of those cases, China is becoming a key hot button issue, in part because Donald Trump and the Americans have said, listen, we want the Western Hemisphere to be free of Chinese influence. Now, that feels ambitious, especially in light of what you're saying, but that is certainly what the Americans want. Talk to us a little bit about how well do you get the sense that this China question in these countries is understood by the policymakers? How well are they versed in China issues? That's why your book is so important, because my reading of it is that China literacy in many of these countries is actually quite low. And so a book like yours could help to fill that void. And when I hear some of the discourse going on, it's quite remedial.
Yeah, I agree. I think our understanding of China and China's engagement in the global south and the main processes that have taken place in China domestically for the last 20 years are not that well understood in national governments. When I lead this project called ICLAC that's funded by the Ministry of Science in Chile. So we have meetings constantly with ministries, officials, and part of our goal is to create materials for them to use and to understand with data and with objectivity the complexities of China's engagement in this region.
And is
Um,
it well received? I mean, are they open to it, or is there an ideological baggage that sometimes gets in the way of a deeper understanding of China?
it's a great question, Eric. I think there's differences across countries. In Chile and Argentina, I think the understanding has become a little bit more nuanced in the last few years. I met a lot of resistance and prejudice and stereotypes in Colombia, for example. The three times I've been to, the responses, well, Chinese are mean. We are not interested in the Chinese. So that's the first sort of answer from everyone, kind of not even willing to discuss the topic. So Colombia is a country that's historically, culturally is very much aligned with the U.S. Mexico as well. I went to Monterrey 2 times, right next to the border, and students in university were also kind of very kind of putting barriers for even to speak about the topic. There's a lot of openness in Argentina and Chile and in Brazil more so, I think. So there's variations. China has become a contending issue in elections. So presidents and presidential candidates now need to prepare a few answers on what they think of China, because China has become again a main economic partner. And for those anti-communist candidates, they need to have a coherent position on how they will lead or deal with this situation. Um, and we track public opinion yearly, at least in Chile, on what do people think of China. COVID damaged very deeply China's soft power
Yeah.
in this part of the world, and we live in a region where uh, people's heart are with the U.S. So I think, and I say that in the book, Latin America is kind of a hard test for me for China's engagement in the global South, because elites and citizenry are very much aligned with the U.S. in terms of values and
Do you think that's the same in this current era as well, where the U.S. has become very hard on Latino migrants and has been the deportations and all of that? Do you think that's going to stay that way?
I think there will be changes. We are carrying out our 2025 survey in 10 days, and we have a few questions on the tariffs and on Trump's rhetoric. I think that will affect that very much the U.S.'s perception in the region. Um, yeah, there's bitterness on that side. Even in Chile, there's a free trade agreement with the U.S. and the U.S. Put a tariff to Chile, and that was felt very deeply. Um, Especially because meanwhile other countries like Ecuador have signed free trade agreements with China and move forward. So there's this sense of, in the last few months with Trump's election, kind of the U.S. trying to put blocks, offering a lot of sticks and not many carrots. Perhaps the big carrots are offered to Milei only, but for the rest of the region, there's a lot of sticks, and trying to contain China with threats.
Yeah. Just quickly before we go, this is a very polarized time, and you talked about how there's this alignment with the U.S., and I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. A lot of the media that comes from the United States into South and Central America is Spanish language media. So it's not like it's Anglo media coming in. A lot of it is Telemundo, is Univision, is all the Spanish media coming in. So a lot of those American values are being transmitted directly in Spanish, which is very compelling, and it makes for very powerful soft power. So combating that. But one of the things that I've noticed over the past year in talking to China Latin America scholars is a little bit of a sense of beleaguerment. You're caught in between two powers in this very polarized time, and pressure is coming. And we have people in our network who have received direct threats and pressure from the U.S. embassies in their countries. And at the same time, the Chinese have scolded them for not being sufficiently supportive either. And so I'm curious what it's like for someone like you in a country like Chile, be and writing a book like this. What's it like at this time to be studying this topic?
It's extremely hard, Eric. I agree with what you describe. There's being a huge pressure from Western agencies. I don't know how to refer to them because I don't want to say the American embassy. The American embassy has never said anything to me, but there's um, an agenda, and then on China's side as well. In this project that I lead, we are always feeling the sense of we are kind of balancing and trying to remain neutral as much as we can, and not making anyone happy. We always joke that if anyone is happy, we are succeeding. Actually, that's kind of our motto. Um, and funding from the Ministry of Science in that sense for us is key. We wouldn't be able to be happy making everyone unhappy if it wasn't the case. Um, I think that would eventually backlash. I think you simply cannot constrain scholars by trying to push an agenda of saying that the Chinese are bad and that all they do is to promote autocracy or promote death traps. On the other hand, it's extremely unfruitful to speak of China as this new miracle and that anything that they do is positive. They are causing a lot of problems for us as well. I think we need nuisance here, and to think for our own. I think we need to really gather data for our own and try to create policy documentation and analysis that speaks for ourselves. I think it's our task to do so. There's a few interesting projects on global China's engagement in a few countries, in Peru, Colombia, Brazil, Chile. So I think we are very much needed. And the book tried to base every or most of its statements with data. You can download the data in a link that I provided and replicate everything. And the reason why it took me like 6 years or 7 years to write the book, it's because of the data, not so much for the writing. Despite I'm not a native English speaker, the problem was more, where do I find data to answer the most basic questions that you have made? What do people think of China? How do you compare China's engagement to American engagement? Um, what do political elites think and how they react? To ask those very basic questions, we had first to look for basic data. So Latin America as a region has been less investigated than Africa, for example. I think, well, you have I think you have had here great scholars studying China-Africa relations, and I think the state of the art of China-African relations, it's a little bit ahead of what we have in South America, and that's reflective, I think, on a broader trend. I think we still, as a society, don't understand China that well. And you see that. I hope we will have you here in Chile eventually. You will see that
Yes, I'd
when
love
you
that.
have conversations with elites, with politicians, with scholars. Even my colleagues sometimes wonder what I do studying China. China is such a weird country. So, there's not a sense of this economic superpower that's challenging the U.S. in so many realms. That's driving the economy and the 21st century to become a Pacific Ocean century. That understanding kind of is not really tangible here. Probably because of the very important historical importance of the U.S. and our kind of cultural alignment with the U.S. as well.
Yeah. Well, think of us as brothers in arms in the pursuit of fact based analysis. We completely understand where you're coming from on that and support it. And so, really applaud the great work that you've done with this book, Economic Displacement, China and the End of U.S. Primacy in Latin America, by Francisco Urdinez, who is an assistant professor at the Political Science Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Thank you so much for your time today, Francisco. Congratulations. Francisco is going to share with us again a promo code that you will be able to use to purchase the book. And I really want to emphasize that this is not one of those academic books that costs $175. There's going to be a digital version that's going to be very affordable, and then a softback version as well that's going to be affordable, like a normal book price. And so with the discount code that you can use, you'll be able to get it, again, a little cheaper than normal. And so the book comes out at the end of October. So if you're listening to this in October, you got to wait a little bit, but in November, you'll be able to buy it. And by the way, Francisco, the timing is perfect because the book will be coming out around the same time as our new Spanish language website, China en las Americas, will be coming out. We have a wonderful editor in Lima, Peru, Maria Cervantes, who is putting together just a beautiful site in Spanish to help fill some of the voids that you've talked about in terms of China literacy. That is the goal of this website. No paywall. It will be showcasing great scholarly work from people like you, news updates, analysis. We're going to have a podcast. There's going to be a newsletter. So, Francisco, I hope that you'll be a regular consumer and reader of our new Spanish language website, and really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely, thank you, Eric. I will give those pieces to my students. And I'm very sure I will use them regularly. I also look forward for the maps, like the ones you have for Africa. Again, there's a need in this part of the world for the kind of work that you do. So I think you will do very well indeed. And I'm looking forward for the launch of the Spanish site because there's a demand here for that kind of material.
You can feel it, and it's something that we're very excited about. This is something I've wanted to do for 5 years now. I've been trying to get this to happen, and it's finally happening. The site is ready. We just need one signature from our photo license agency, and then we can start. As soon as we get that, we're off and running. So, Francisco, again, thank you so much for your time. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. If you'd like to support the work that we're doing at the China Global South Project, the best way to do it is to sign up for a subscription, which you'll receive our China Global South Daily Brief. That goes out to about 25 governments. We support NGOs, we've got governments, we've got corporations, and just a lot of interested people who want to follow what China's doing in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and of course in Latin America. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And if you are a teacher or a student, we give you half off, $10 a month, very cheap. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So for the entire team at CGSP around the world, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this episode. I'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening and for watching.